Opening the center with the queen's pawn immediately challenges black's control and aims for rapid development. Developing the knight here immediately contests central space and prepares for pawn breaks, a flexible and aggressive opening choice. Fortifying the knight's central dominion, this development anticipates further pawn advancements and aids in controlling vital squares. Solidifying the center, this move immediately contests the d4 pawn, setting the stage for a dynamic pawn battle. Opening the center further, white seeks to exploit dynamic pawn structures for an initiative. Solidifying the center while preparing to develop the king's bishop defines this purposeful maneuver. Solidifying the center and preparing development, white opts for a patient approach, reinforcing their pawn chain. Black immediately challenges white's central pawn chain, creating a dynamic pawn structure and opening lines for piece development. Solidifying central control, nc3 prepares development and supports the d4 pawn's presence, initiating a strategic dance for initiative. Solidifying central influence and preparing to contest the d5 pawn with active piece placement. Instantly liberating the d-file, this capture reshapes the central pawn structure, potentially creating isolated pawn weaknesses or opening avenues for active piece play, demanding careful calculation of ensuing tactical exchanges. Recapturing the pawn with the knight immediately resolves the central tension, preparing for a more fluid development where your minor pieces can find active squares. Developing the bishop to d3 aims to control the central squares and prepare for kingside castling, a solidifying move that connects the rooks and shores up the king's safety by clearing the way for a potential f4 push later. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies black's kingside and prepares for castling, a crucial step in securing the monarch's safety amid this queen's gambit declined structure. Securing the king's safety by tucking it away behind a pawn shield is a sensible priority, especially given the central pawn tension and the developing piece activity. Safeguarding the king amidst this opening skirmish is paramount, and casting the monarch to the side achieves exactly that, preparing for potential central breakthroughs. Preparing for a potential queenside pawn push with b4 secures the bishop and prevents immediate counterplay, creating a more robust pawn structure while maintaining flexibility in developing the queen's bishop. Black embraces simplification, opting to exchange pawns and open the c-file for potential counterplay. This decision prepares for a more open game, and the subsequent recapture will likely involve the knight, aiming to establish it on a central square or support further pawn advances. Opening the central files, white seeks to exploit the d4 pawn's newfound centrality, aiming to activate pieces like the queen and bishop while potentially creating attacking chances against black's kingside. This choice prioritizes dynamic development over maintaining a closed pawn structure, a strategic gamble that invites sharp play. Reclaiming the square after the pawn exchange offers a timely regrouping for the knight, repositioning it to a central outpost that controls vital squares and prepares for potential pawn breaks or even a kingside sortie. Sharpening the focus on the queenside development, white repositions their bishop to eye the long diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially prepare for a kingside assault later. Embarking on a plan to fianchetto the bishop, black aims to activate their kingside potential, though this maneuver implicitly concedes space on the queenside and opens the door for potential queenside expansion by white should they choose to advance pawns. The rook's assertion on the open c-file immediately intensifies the pressure, not just on the pawn structure, but also towards black's potential weaknesses developing behind their own lines. The bishop on b7 now eyes the long diagonal, aiming to become an active piece in this queen's gambit decline structure and challenge white's central influence. Shifting the queen to e2 is a smart preparatory maneuver, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially support a kingside advance or a central pawn push later on. It avoids immediate confrontation and allows white to consolidate their central pawn structure while keeping options open for knight development or a bishop maneuver. This calm coordination builds pressure subtly, preparing for future dynamic play without committing prematurely. Black boldly introduces the knight to g4 immediately challenging white's central bishop and hinting at aggressive intentions. This maneuver not only aims to disrupt white's harmonious development, but also opens up possibilities for a kingside attack if white is not careful, potentially creating dangerous diagonal lines towards the castled king. Shifting the bishop to f4 proactively prepares for potential kingside pressure, while reinforcing the central pawn chain and limiting black's knight's scope on g4. Boldly snatching the pawn, black initiates a tactical sequence that momentarily disrupts white's harmonious piece placement, aiming to exploit the open d-file. The knight's return to d4 decisively resolves the pawn tension on that square, immediately posing a threat to black's central presence and setting up potential tactical strikes. Seizing the center pawn with the queen opens a direct diagonal assault on white's king position, creating immediate tactical pressure that white must meticulously address. Unleashing the queen to disrupt black's central pawn chain creates immediate tactical chaos, forcing a recalculation of piece valuations and potentially leaving black's monarch exposed. A daring queen sortie, essentially offering a piece to disrupt white's center and open lines, but it hinges entirely on whether the subsequent calculation is flawless. This exchange initiates a sharp tactical sequence. Black gambles that the discovered attack on the bishop and the potential disruption of white's pawn structure will compensate for the sacrificed material. The key is the pressure now brought to bear on the d3 pawn, which is undefended, and the subsequent threat to the unprotected white king. However, black must be acutely aware that this move leaves their own king somewhat exposed to counterplay if white can consolidate effectively. The entire game now hinges on black's ability to exploit the tactical chaos they've deliberately sown. This maneuver immediately seizes the open d-file, a crucial conduit for piece penetration, as black's queen vacates this vital central axis. White aims to consolidate their advantage by activating the rook and pressuring the d5 pawn, which is now poorly defended after the queen's relocation. The placement here suggests a subtle preparation for a potential kingside initiative or a tightening of the screws in the center, where white enjoys a slight edge in piece development and central influence. Unleashing the queen to this active square, black aims to disrupt white's central control and probe for weaknesses, a bold maneuver that creates immediate tactical tension and opens up possibilities for counterplay along the open lines. Trading queens here simplifies the position dramatically, potentially steering the game towards an endgame where the initiative white gained with the earlier pawn sacrifice becomes paramount. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, transforming this into a strategic battle where black must now focus on reorganizing their pieces. The doubled pawns on the g-file, while creating weaknesses, also offer a potential outpost for pieces if black can properly support them, aiming to activate the bishop on b7 and challenge white's control of the open c-file. The rook powerfully invades the 7th rank, disrupting black's entire pawn structure and threatening devastating incursions. Suddenly, a crucial defensive obligation surfaces for black, forcing a calculation of whether the bishop can survive this onslaught on the c5 square, lest it become a target for the advancing rook. Liberating the bishop from its pawn cover, white aims to re-establish central influence and contest the open d-file, while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks. The bishop now eyes the queenside, a clever repositioning aiming to pressure the weakened structure around white's king and potentially participate in an endgame scenario where its scope might be superior. Asserting dominance on the 7th rank, the rook cleaves through black's defenses, directly threatening the vulnerable c5 bishop and simultaneously eyeing the d7 pawn, forcing an immediate strategic reevaluation for the defender. Rethinking the piece distribution, black redirects the rook's attention from its less productive placement on c8 to the vital c-file, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially create counterplay against the isolated d-pawn. A decisive exchange is initiated, forcing a simplification that fundamentally alters the character of the battlefield, presenting a clear decision point for black regarding the long-term implications of the open file. The rook's capture initiates a decisive exchange, simplifying the position and entering an endgame where white's bishop pair might seem attractive. But black's active pieces, particularly the bishop on c6, are poised to exploit the open files. Seizing initiative on the open c-file, this knight's outpost at b5 directly challenges black's queen and aims to exploit the lingering weaknesses around the king and potential for pawn structure collapse. A bold strategic gambit is being played here, aiming to establish dominance over the crucial central squares and force a favorable pawn structure. The piece repositioning signals a clear intent to exploit the weakened dark squares around the opponent's king, hinting at potential future attacks through open diagonals. Securing the queenside flank and preventing black's bishop from finding a more active diagonal is the primary goal here, creating a robust pawn shield. Expanding the queenside pawn structure to gain space and limit the influence of black's bishop on c5 is a sound strategic decision, establishing a solid defensive perimeter. A purposeful pawn push aiming to shore up white's queenside position and potentially prepare for future expansion on that wing. This pawn advances to reinforce the queenside pawn chain, making it more resilient to potential breakthroughs by black's pieces. The pawn's movement aims to create breathing room on the queenside, ensuring that white's pieces have adequate maneuvering space and preventing black's pieces from penetrating. The exchange of bishops definitively opens up the d-file for white's remaining rook, a crucial strategic asset now that the queens are off the board and white's knight is securely posted on b5, eyeing the vulnerable c7 square. Black, by sacrificing bishop activity for this pawn structure concession, finds their king's safety potentially compromised as white's pieces begin to coordinate. Trading down immediately with the rook exchange simplifies the position dramatically, heading towards an endgame where the active rook presence on the 7th rank will be a significant factor. Sacrificing material to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay often proves to be a sound strategic decision. Consolidating the pawn structure is the immediate priority after the exchanges, establishing a more robust central presence. Harnessing the open file now, black intends to activate the bishop, creating a defensive bastion and eyeing potential infiltration down the c-file as the game simplifies. Asserting control over the central dark squares, the knight's repositioning aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially create a passed pawn later on. The monarch ventures out of its defensive cocoon, seeking fresh pastures, a bold maneuver in this endgame that prioritizes activity over the subtle dangers of an exposed king. Opening up the central pawns allows the king to finally become an active participant, aiming to dominate the now clear e-file and contest the open d-file with its opponent. Opening the center with the pawn advance confronts the opponent's advanced knight, a pivotal decision that will dictate the character of the ensuing middle game struggle. Anticipate potential pawn breaks and pawn structure weaknesses. The monarch begins a journey towards the center, seeking to participate more actively in the unfolding endgame and potentially secure a safer square than its current exposed position. Pivoting the bishop to the active c6 square now aims to challenge control over the key central dark squares, potentially leading to exchanges that simplify the position and offer a clearer path towards realizing your endgame aspirations. A calculated repositioning aims to solidify control of the central e4 square and prepare for potential kingside advances, subtly challenging black's rather passive development. Sacrificing the bishop to consolidate pawns offers a dynamic shift, potentially freeing the rook and allowing for a decisive pawn push on the kingside once the enemy knight is evicted from the central outpost. Seizing the initiative with a tactical pawn advance, white aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the vulnerability of the e5 square, potentially opening lines for the knight and creating pressure on the kingside. The king's dance towards the center, finally escaping the pawn chain's restrictive grip, signals a bold attempt to find sanctuary and activate itself in the ensuing endgame. The knight's repositioning to c4 offers a dynamic central pivot, threatening to infiltrate black's weakened pawn structure and potentially force awkward exchanges that could compromise the king's safety. A crucial moment arrives for the black king, now venturing from its sheltered corner towards the center of the board. a bold maneuver aiming to activate its defensive and offensive potential within this rapidly simplifying position. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, this maneuver prepares to contest the central dark squares and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The monarch ventures forward, seeking active participation in the endgame, but the knight's formidable outpost on e3 presents a palpable threat to this newfound central ambition. Pivoting the monarch towards the center now prepares to activate it as a fighting piece, aiming to exploit the central open space and support its pawns while eyeing any lingering weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The monarch, finally escaping its pawn shield, seeks active participation on d4, aiming to exploit the centralized outpost it now occupies and disrupt white's slightly clumsy pawn structure. The white king bravely ventures towards the center, seeking an active role in the evolving pawn battle and aiming to solidify its position before any tactical surprises can erupt. The bishop's retreat to c6 finally clarifies its role, transitioning from a passive defender of the d7 outpost to a more active piece, potentially eyeing the weak e4 pawn and supporting an advance into white's territory. Fortifying the king's sanctuary becomes paramount as white solidifies the kingside pawn structure, creating a secure haven against any potential late-game incursions from the adversary's determined monarch. Bringing the bishop back to its starting square, the board now seems to settle as the pawn structure becomes rigid, a quiet maneuver aiming to solidify the position and potentially support a future pawn advance on the kingside, awaiting white's next strategic decision. Asserting central presence, the knight now reclaims the e3 square, preparing to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the queenside, creating dynamic imbalances in this endgame. The black monarch ventures into the heart of white's territory, seeking active participation but exposing itself to potential dangers. The knight repositions, aiming to contest the central squares and prevent black's bishop from gaining further influence. The black king boldly advances into enemy territory, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create passed pawns. The king bravely advances, seeking more central dominion in this endgame clash, aiming to disrupt black's bishop's influence and potentially trap it. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, black aims to create immediate chaos and open lines, a sharp response to white's king infiltration, hoping to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn majority and force concessions before the inevitable endgame. The king's bold advance, venturing into the heart of enemy territory, now faces a crucial test of nerve and positional understanding. The bishop, finally finding a more active square, eyes the enemy king's path and offers support for the advancing pawns, aiming to disrupt white's centralized knight and potentially create a passed pawn in the long run. King's journey across the board now finds itself cornered, facing an immediate threat of opposition that will severely restrict its mobility and dictate the pace of the coming exchanges. Unleashing the king into the heart of the opposing pawn structure, a bold gambit to seize the initiative. Consolidating the gained material advantage, the king marches forward, claiming central dominion and preparing to escort its advanced pawns towards promotion, a decisive step in converting the material superiority. The black monarch embarks on a daring raid, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and infiltrate deeper into enemy territory. Clearing the king's path ensures it can actively participate in the endgame's maneuvering for this crucial final push towards victory. The king's bold trek across the board, embracing the open space on g2, now faces immediate scrutiny as white's forces converge, threatening to trap this adventurous monarch in a pincer movement. King's journey across the board, a daring raid to seize crucial pawns, culminating in a powerful pawn chain poised to overwhelm the defender. With the opponent's king now exposed and isolated, this capture aims to dismantle the remaining pawn shield, further weakening the royal position and creating drawing chances through perpetual check or simplification. Pushing the g-pawn now offers a final, albeit minimal, chance to disrupt black's king's path to freedom, potentially forcing them to spend valuable tempi securing their monarch rather than advancing their remaining pawns towards promotion. Pushing the b-pawn opens a crucial path for the black king to potentially gain activation, aiming to swing across the board and create counterplay against white's isolated pawns. The white monarch bravely advances, challenging black's central pawn mass and aiming to exploit the open files for a decisive breakthrough. The black king, finding itself in a dangerous open field after its foray, must now prioritize safety and regroup. Pushing the g-pawn here aims to activate white's king, initiating a race to create a passed pawn from the kingside majority and potentially forcing concessions from the black king that's already quite exposed. Heralding the king's final march, this pawn thrust seeks to create a decisive escape square for the monarch, aiming to exploit the overextended white king and secure a winning passed pawn advantage.